Camp Dudley, Westport, New York, Lake Champlain.
Yes,
Day
that makes
1
perfect
of Ruth
sense.
Levine's first summer as a
Excellent.
counselor,
Any
summer
questions?
1952. She was 19. She had been a camper at this lake for 8 summers, beginning at 10. She attended the counselor orientation, which covered emergency procedures, program planning, cabin conflict management, and a section on homesickness, to which she paid little attention. She had been a camper. She knew what homesickness was. She knew what day 3 looked like. She had been that girl at 2:30 on a first session Tuesday with the unfinished letter. The homesickness section of orientation seemed, from the inside, like a description of something she already owned. She was right that she had lived it. She was wrong about what living it meant for watching someone else live it. Wrong in a way that the American Camp Association's research on first-year versus veteran counselors would document specifically, that having been through the passage is not the same as knowing how to read the passage from outside. Camp Dudley had been correcting this specific misunderstanding in first-year counselors for 67 years. It could wait one more summer. Camp Dudley accepted boys regardless of color, creed, or ethnic background from its first season in 1885, a fact documented in the American Camp Association's centennial history. Sumner Francis Dudley, 30 years old, had taken 7 boys to Orange Lake, New Jersey, for a week's encampment with backing from 2 YMCA colleagues. After his death in 1897, the camp continued under his name and settled permanently at Westport, New York, in 1908, under H.C. Chief Beckman, who directed it for 39 years. The motto, "The Other Fellow First," was adopted in the early 20th century. Each new camper received a consecutive number, the camp's way of placing every individual within the unbroken line of those who had come before. By 1952, that line stretched past 7,000. What an institution that had been running for 67 consecutive summers had accumulated about the first summer counselor's error, the error of confusing having been through the passage with knowing how to watch it from the other side, was specific. It didn't live in any document. Where did it live? Day 3 of the first session, summer 1952, 2:30 in the afternoon. Rest hour at Camp Dudley. Ruth Levine, in her first summer as a counselor, walked through the rest hour area and passed a boy with an unfinished letter on the outdoor table in front of him. She noted the letter. She did not know what she was noting. The American Camp Association's research on first-year versus veteran counselors confirms what Camp Dudley's accumulated practice had known for decades. First-year counselors do not lack care or intelligence. They lack pattern. What Ruth saw at 2:30 on day 3 of her first summer was a boy with an unfinished letter. What she did not yet have was any framework for why the incompleteness of the letter at 2:30 on day 3 of the first session was different in kind from an unfinished letter at any other moment. She offered something to the boy. He accepted it politely. It did not address anything. She didn't know it hadn't worked until the same letter was still there at 4 o'clock. Ruth Levine's first summer as a counselor ended in August 1952. She went back to college. She did not write down what she had noticed. She had noticed things she could not yet explain. A boy whose letter was still unfinished on day 7, who had seemed fine by day 8. A girl who had wanted to call home on day 4, and had not asked by day 9. A first-year counselor in the adjacent cabin, who had offered comfort in the wrong direction, and whose camper had withdrawn further. She had noticed these things, without understanding what she was noticing. The ACA research on veteran versus new counselors describes what Ruth was accumulating without naming it as knowledge. The veteran counselor's advantage is not instruction. It is accumulated observation that has not yet become theory, but has changed the way the veteran sees. What the first summer left in Ruth was not knowledge. It was something that would become knowledge in the second summer, if the second summer placed her in front of the same set of events. The camp knew this. It had been holding this for 67 years. What does a camp do with the knowledge that experience cannot be given? Ruth Levine returned to Camp Dudley for her second summer in June 1953. The second orientation covered the same material. She paid closer attention to the homesickness section, not because she had studied it between summers, she hadn't, but because the first summer had left something in her that the section now seemed to describe obliquely. Day 3 of the first session, summer 1953, 2:30 in the afternoon. Rest hour. She was walking through the outdoor table area when she saw a boy with an unfinished letter. She stopped. She stopped before she had decided to stop, which was the difference. Something accumulated in the first summer had been waiting for this, waiting to confirm something it had registered, without knowing how to name. She did not yet know what to do with the recognition, but she knew what she was seeing in a way she had not known in 1952. That knowing, without the corresponding action, was the second summer's first gift to her and the third summer's first prerequisite. The American Camp Association's research on veteran versus new counselors confirms that veteran counselors may have considerable knowledge about how to undertake their jobs that new counselors cannot yet have, regardless of orientation quality. What the research does not specify is what that knowledge contains. What it is not is procedural. Ruth Levine's first summer had given her all three procedures that Camp Dudley's orientation provided for homesickness intervention: create space, acknowledge the feeling, redirect toward activity. She had deployed all three on day 3 of the first session, 1952. None had reached what the unfinished letter was showing. Procedures address what homesickness looks like in an orientation document. Recognition, the second summer's gift, addresses what it looks like when the observer already knows what she is observing. What Ruth had by day 3 of the second session, 1953, was not a new procedure. It was the beginning of a map of a territory she had visited once before. She could not yet navigate the territory. She could recognize she was in it. By the end of the second summer, Ruth had accumulated a set of observations she had not had at the end of the first. Not a theory, a set. She noticed that the letter was still unfinished at 2:30 on day 3, almost regardless of which boy was writing it. She noticed that the boy who withdrew after comfort was offered was not withdrawing from the counselor, but from the wrong answer. She noticed that the boy who was fine by day 8 had not been given anything by day 7, but had arrived at something on his own. She noticed that the senior counselor in the adjacent cabin, a man in his 5th summer, did not offer comfort on day 3, and that his campers were different in a specific way by day 7. 4 observations, not connected into a theory, waiting to be connected. That was the second summer's bequest to the third, not the answer, but the observations that the third summer would organize into something that could act. Ruth Levine completed her second summer as a Camp Dudley counselor in August 1953 and returned to college. She did not write down her 4 observations. She did not discuss them with the adjacent cabin's veteran counselor. She did not look for a framework that would explain them. What she had were 4 specific observations that had changed what she noticed, but not yet what she knew how to do. Between the second and third summers, she was accumulating, without knowing she was accumulating, the specific residue that residential camp experience had always been depositing in the counselors who came back. Not a theory about children, but a pattern of observation, becoming recognition, without yet becoming action. The American Camp Association's research on experienced versus new counselors describes the endpoint of this process. It does not describe the middle. Camp Dudley's record of 39 years under H.C. Beckman, if it had been kept in this particular form, would have described it in detail. What happens to a person between the second and third summers who does not know they are being prepared to know something? Ruth Levine returned to Camp Dudley for her third summer as a counselor in June 1954. She was 21. She had been at this camp as camper and counselor for 10 summers. The American Camp Association's research on veteran versus new counselors states that veteran counselors possess considerable knowledge about their work that new counselors cannot yet have. The research uses considerable as a descriptor without specifying the contents. At the start of Ruth's third summer, the contents were these. She knew that the letter at 2:30 on day 3 was showing her something specific, and she knew what it was showing her. She knew that the recognition did not require immediate action. She knew what the boy with the unfinished letter did not yet need, and did not yet know he would have by morning. She could not have said where the knowing came from. It came from 47 specific observations across 2 summers. The third summer was the first summer in which she could use what the first 2 had built. Day 3 of the first session, summer 1954, 2:30 in the afternoon, rest hour at Camp Dudley. Ruth Levine saw the letter on the table before she had crossed half the distance to it. She saw the boy's posture before she reached the letter. The posture told her what the letter confirmed. This was not a letter that had not been finished yet. It was a letter that had been stopped because what it had started to say was no longer accurate. She did not stop at the table. She did not offer comfort. She did not redirect toward the afternoon activity. She walked past. She came back 20 minutes later. The letter was still unfinished. She sat down across from the boy, not beside him, and said something that was not about the letter, and was not about going home, and was specifically about what was true at 2:30 on day 3 at Camp Dudley. She had learned what was true there. It had taken 2 summers to learn it. The 3rd summer was when she first used it. The specific things the 3rd summer counselor did on day 3 of the first session, 1954, that she had not done in 1952 or 1953, were 3. She walked past the first time. She came back at the right 20 minutes. She sat across rather than beside. What she said was not about the letter, and was not about going home, and was specifically about something true, at 2:30 on day 3 at Camp Dudley, on a Tuesday, in the first session. The ACA research describes veteran counselors as possessing considerable knowledge. What that knowledge contained, at this specific moment, was this. She knew comfort addressed the wrong thing. She knew redirection delayed what the boy actually needed. She knew what he needed would arrive by day 7 if she did not interfere with its arrival. She had not been given these 3 things by any orientation. She had built them from 47 observations across 2 summers. The 3rd summer was the first summer. All 3 were available to her simultaneously when she needed them. Camp Dudley's counselor orientation covered what a document could cover: emergency procedures, program planning, cabin conflict management, a section on homesickness, documented in the ACA Camping Magazine account of a similar era as covering, at many camps, little more than an acknowledgement that it existed and a few suggested responses. What the orientation did not cover, what no orientation in the history of the American Camp Association's documented training standards has covered, was when to walk past, when to come back, where to sit, and what to say that was specifically true at 2:30 on day 3 at this camp on a Tuesday in the first session. It could not cover this because these were not procedural items. They were the specific accumulation of what happened when a person who had lived through the passage stood outside it across 47 separate occasions and found that the 47th observation completed what the first 46 had begun. No document can install that. The camp knew this. It had been waiting for counselors to reach the 3rd summer for 69 years. The boys in Ruth Levine's bunk in the 3rd summer of 1954 received something different from what the boys in her bunk in 1952 had received. Not in the program was the same. Not in her care, she had cared in 1952 as genuinely as in 1954. The difference was in what she could read. The first summer, when a boy had an unfinished letter at 2:30 on day 3, she had offered something procedural that did not reach what the letter was showing. The 3rd summer, she knew when to walk past, when to return, where to sit, and what to say that was specifically true at this hour, at this camp, on this day of a first session. The boys in the 3rd summer's bunk did not know they were receiving what 47 observations had built. They could not have described the difference between a first summer counselor's attention and a 3rd summer counselor's attention, but the ACA's documented outcomes of residential camp across decades are consistent. The counselor who can read the specific moment changes what the moment produces. In 1954, Ruth Levine changed what day 3 produced. The American Camp Association documented what happened to American residential camps from the mid-1970s. More than 2,500 camps went out of business. Many traditional 8-week camps introduced shorter sessions. What the shorter session did to program is documented. What it did to the counselor's 3rd summer is less documented but follows directly. A camp offering 2 4-week sessions instead of 1 8-week session faced different staffing economics. The counselor who could only commit to 1 4-week session each summer would not accumulate the same observation set as the counselor who spent 8 consecutive weeks at the same camp. The turnover rate among seasonal camp staff rose through the 1970s and 1980s. What disappeared from many camps was not care, not orientation, not the program. What disappeared was the third summer itself, the specific season in which the 47th observation arrived and connected the first 46. A camp whose counselors averaged 1 or 2 summers before moving on was a camp that consistently delivered first summer attention to every generation of children who passed through it. The reading was not wrong, it was early. Camp Dudley has run continuously since 1885, 140 summers as of this writing. H.C. Beckman directed it for 39 years from its permanent Lake Champlain site. In those 39 years, Beckman accumulated the equivalent of 39 third summers, the same 47 observations Ruth Levine made across 2 summers, rebuilt every summer for nearly 4 decades, and organized into something that no orientation document has yet described adequately. What Camp Dudley's institutional continuity protected across 140 years was not tradition as sentiment. It was tradition as the specific vehicle through which the knowledge that accumulation builds, and only accumulation builds, could pass from person to person across generations. The consecutive numbering of every camper since the early 20th century was not a census. It was the record of every person who had been given something by this specific lake and this specific program, and many of them, given the chance to return, had given it back in the form of the third summer. That is what the camp had been holding since 1885. What does a camp that holds that for 140 years know that a camp that does not hold it cannot know?